I'd like to invite to the stage our panellists for our last session, which is called From Paddock to Postcode. Ethan Kent, our international keynote speaker, I invite you back to the stage. I'd also like to invite Dr. Michael Fotheringham, who is Executive Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, or AHURI, who've been a great supporter and a great partner of NGAA. And we are included on some of their expert panels from time to time. So it's great to have Michael here. I'd also like to introduce Kathryn Seirlis, who is tasked with an enormous role of managing growth and investment in the city of Casey, which is, I think, is Victoria's largest council, yes. And not only are there, hundreds, if not thousands, of people moving there every week and month, but there's 100 new babies arrive every week,
And 100 dogs registered every week.
There
as
you
well.
go. Take your pick. See, they're inclusive in Casey. And also like to just thank Kathryn and the City of Casey. They've partnered with us along with the City of Swan to bring Congress together today. So their support is invaluable. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Kim Johnstone from the Astrolabe group, another great friend of NGAA. Now, Kim has a really interesting bio, which you should have a look at because she's got some interesting expertise in diverse areas. Welcome, all of you. The point of this session, well, it all began when I came over to the City of Swan in May to do a recce of this venue and see where will we hold Congress. And I was obviously looking for a microbrewery venue because that's our tradition, but we've gone with a winery instead. So, but I drove down this road. So if you come out of the Vines and you turn left, and you go down just a really nice road. It's nicely made. There's nice houses, and on the right, after about 500 metres, you see a lovely paddock. It's a beautiful scene. There's a bit of barbed wire fence, there's some trees, there's dirt that's been worked, it's been very productive ground over the years. And then you see the colour-bond fence. And you think that's the paddock that's left out of what used to be vast paddocks. Just on the other side of that fence is a suburb. It's where thousands of people live. So I thought this is a great way to bring together what we've been talking about today. How do you make that paddock into a postcode? How do we build that community from the ground up? So we will have a discussion today, and we're going to do it in a sort of a hypothetical style. So I'll just read out a little situation which I think some of you will be familiar with. Last week, the State Planning Minister announced a new land release in the outer suburbs that will contain 50,000 housing lots. State government estimates around 120,000 people will call these new areas home. The land is all in outer metropolitan greenfield areas and is spread across 2 local government areas. One of those LGAs, we'll call it the Shire of Greenfield, is currently home to just 30,000 people. So they've already had their population explosion first time round when 11,000 people moved in, but it won't be long until another 60,000 arrive. The Planning Minister says there's a housing affordability crisis. He wants the houses built as soon as possible. And although the new land release does not connect with existing rail and light rail network, there is a long-term plan to extend the public transport networks. This will, he says, get people to jobs in the capital city, which is around 60 kilometres away, or it will get them to employment hubs in neighbouring areas 10 to 15 kilometres away. So we're going to unpack what that means, and we're going to draw on some expertise here. And I think, Kim, could you kick off by telling us, from a demographic perspective, who's going to move into that paddock?
I mean, that's a really good question, and this is something that Glenn opened today with talking about how a lot of the suburbs that are part of NGAA have changed So while we don't know exactly who's going to move in there, we do know a lot about what happens. We know that the people most likely to move into those new areas are those that live near it already. And like just last night I was talking with some people about how the people who are moving in are those children who have grown up in the neighbouring area and can't afford to live, and so they then move into new greenfield areas because they can afford to buy houses, or people who have moved away and then want to return and they can afford to live there. I think Glenn this morning showed very clearly that there's an age profile when these new suburbs open up of who moves into there. I'm most familiar with Sydney, so we also know that a lot of those people, there'll be Australian-born people, but people who've arrived in Australia maybe 5 to 15 years ago, who would have arrived and lived near the university, for example, become permanent residents, maybe citizens, established households, and then we'll start that migration pathway out. Those are the people who will be moving in. The other thing to remember when we talk about that growth is some of that is from that base that's already there. So the babies being born every week, that's growth. It's not just people moving in. And the other thing that we also need to remember is we're really good at keeping people alive in Australia. We have an excellent healthcare system. So certainly in our capital cities, when we talk about growth, some of that is just because we're really good at people not dying, because when people die, growth slows down. You see that in regional Australia. So that is another factor that's going to be taking place in these areas.
Okay. So Kathryn, as the manager of growth and investment, would you have been involved and consulted along the way in this announcement? And how prepared would you have been when this media release came out?
Oh, it depends. So quite often we might have been involved, but there are certainly times when we have been caught by surprise in announcements like this. I think in the scenario, being a relative, the relatively small size of the Shire and the expected growth would be a real shock to that community and that council and the officers to have to really start getting into that mindset of growth again, or growth that they've never seen before. For a council, I suppose, like Casey, we've been through growth, we've experienced at it, we know how to respond to growth, and we would just deal with it and do the best we could. So in the former, when there isn't much experience or capability within the organisation, the council or the community on growth, that's the time then when things have to pause. There needs to be a lot of planning done around what does that growth mean and look like and do, and what do we want it to feel like, what kind of place do we want to shape with it, and then working through how do we then advocate for what we want, how do we facilitate what we want through partnerships, and then how do we deliver it.
Ethan, if there aren't any people there yet, is it too early to think about placemaking? Do you need to talk to the people first, or what would you do?
This is a very exciting challenge and a good exercise.
Thanks for sticking around.
I mean, you have a challenge and an opportunity here to lead the conversation with how do you create destinations in these high growth areas. I've been a little concerned today that some of the conversation is too much about how do we just supply the facilities, the infrastructure for the growth. So I think we have to get ahead of these conversations. And so in this instance, how do we not be just, whether you're for growth or against growth, we need to be pro-place, because we need to challenge and support whatever existing population there is to leverage whatever investment or people that are coming in to add to their experience of place, to layer purpose and meaning on their spaces and make sure new investment, new people come in to add to that. If we're leading with just facilities, just infrastructure, we're often degrading place. We're actually it may actually be degrading the identity and culture of that existing community and the ecosystem, certainly. And we're finding actually in the States a lot right now that it's financially unsustainable to be leading with this type of infrastructure. There's a big movement called the Strong Towns movement right now. It comes from a very economic perspective, a rather conservative perspective actually, that's proving that towns, on the outskirts of cities and rural communities are bankrupting themselves by building infrastructure based on just demand alone, rather than leveraging that infrastructure investments into the downtowns, into small places in those communities. So engaging communities, we say that for communities that are afraid of change, the best way to deal with that is to have a vision of what they want and to focus that vision into creating small gathering places, these small destinations. We use this Power of 10 tool as a way for them to articulate what their favorite places are, try to get different demographics to articulate where the places they love are, where they think the opportunity places are, and then focus some energy, some investment in those places, and then we try to get investment infrastructure to add to and support those places.
Okay. I'll ask Michael, and probably Kathryn will have something to say on this too, about the stages involved in deciding the type of housing that will go into the paddock, the partnerships with developers that are involved, how perhaps local government could influence those decisions, and how can you get the best outcome from 50,000 new lots?
Thanks.
Sorry.
Not quite the question I was anticipating. I guess the challenge is you'd want to have a mixture of types of housing, of different levels of density and so on. But in the scenario you've painted, longer term plans before rail connects. Now, longer term connection of rail, in my experience, means 2 or 3 generations rather than 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
That means those households are dependent on cars. So 50,000 homes, 120,000 people, maybe 100,000 cars. That makes it fairly hard to do anything more than low density housing in that area. It also makes it very hard to build a sense of community if people are spending all their time in cars at the start and finish of the day. I think, so there's a real challenge there for how do you create a sense of place and community when you've got to drive to everywhere else.
Absolutely. Kathryn, you've got some experience in Casey around starting at the start with planning a community like that. How did you go about it?
So I think for us it's more about, we don't want our growth areas to continue on and on. So we'd rather get the most effective outcome from the land we are going to turn over for housing. So we're open to density in appropriate areas, and trading that off with open space, increases in open space and whatnot. We superlot future areas so that higher density can come in over time as the place matures and the market establishes in and around a low density community. We work with the state government, we work with developers who want to really, as much as you can drive around and get quite lost, there is an attempt to deliver a point of difference in different estates, whether that be through cross sections or tree planting or whatnot. So we try and work through those avenues to come up with an outcome that satisfies us from a future, creating a sustainable future community, and as well as balancing some of those other drivers from state government and the development and property sector.
And so if we go back to the numbers, Kim, is the state government coming up with, we expect 120,000 people? Is that what's going to happen?
So when we see announcements like there's this new development and there's going to be this many houses, part of that is driven has been when state governments are looking at the projected growth for the state and for the capital city, and then going, where are we going to put people? And so I'll talk about New South Wales because I worked in that system for some years, where we do a top-down approach to population and household projections, so the opposite to ID, that do a bottom-up approach, so that you have a constraint. Once you've set assumptions about births and deaths and migration, there is a constraint that the local government and regions can't go past. And that makes sense from a modelling point of view because the numbers are bigger and there's less variation. But once you have that constraint for a city like Sydney, the next question that the planners ask is, well, where are we going to put these people? And then they start looking at where land is zoned that is currently underdeveloped and what the rate of development is, and look at where future land releases can happen. And so that tends to be on the outskirts of cities where there is land more likely to be available. And they start thinking about, well, if we do 50,000 dwellings here, we can fit this number of people in if we assume the average household size across the city holds true. And that's where those numbers would have come from, and that's what would have led to the announcement. But that, of course, is just one part of the puzzle. And I think what I would say to everyone in the room is that is one piece of the information, because then what happens as you get into smaller areas is there might be some more nuanced modelling that would give a more nuanced understanding of how many people might live in what type of houses. So that would see a bit of a different number. For you at the local council level to understand where those numbers have come from and what the assumptions are that sit behind them, because it is just a model at the end of the day. Population is actually highly predictable. Once you're born, you tend to live a year every year. People move in their 20s. If they're going to move, that's the most likely age. What is less certain is actually where do people go, what suburb do they live in, when do they move from one street to the next street over. And so what state government is trying to do is really corral some of that minor movements into an area so that they feel that they've got a bit of control. And if affordable housing is thrown on top of that, supply has tended to be the response to affordable housing. And so that's why we see this kind of thing. So I think different responses to affordable housing is another conversation as well in there.
I'm sure Michael's got something to say about affordable housing, but I just wondered about your thoughts on in all of the hundreds of research projects AHURI has undertaken, have you found some good examples of where the assumptions are right? Or where are some good examples that we could look to?
The population assumption.
Population that then leads to the right housing mix, which has been based on the infrastructure being in place.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are certainly examples of good practice, and our reports highlight many of those. But I do think the affordability challenges are really important to mention to this. Given the sorts of largely low-density housing that this scenario paints and the transport costs attached to it, I think we need to stop thinking about housing affordability just in terms of what the mortgage cost is or what the rent cost is, but much more broadly, taking into account transport costs, transport time cost, energy costs. You know, there are a range of fixed costs attached to your housing that, in a scenario like the one we're talking about at the Greenfields site you're talking about, Greenfield Shire, will be highly challenging. You know, ideally, we would like to see inclusionary zoning in new developments, but this scenario makes that pretty difficult to do.
Ethan, so looking at all of that, we're not confident with the numbers necessarily. We've started perhaps some partnerships and discussions with developers. Where would you go next? How would you bring the players together to start collaborating and coming up with the long-term plan?
Yeah, indeed. In a way, you know, the town teams model made.
Yeah.
How do we proactively create town teams? But you know, because you know, we say it takes a place to create a community to create a place. You know, there's always some people there that want to develop some leadership, focusing them on a place, building capacity. But I'm concerned that if we just build because of it's affordable, or if people are just coming because it's affordable, or just because of lifestyle, and they're consuming lifestyle, even if it's high end, you know, we're missing the opportunity to leverage the investment, and frankly, we're creating a community that is ultimately going to become unaffordable, or it's going to be placeless, and there's not going to be the place attachment, and you know, that's in an era, you know, where people are going to be able to move where they like more than ever. They're going to be able to invest where they like. Increasingly, the place identity, the place attachment is going to be a deciding force. And so I really think we need to get ahead of. We need to drive investment, drive development around adding to places. We need to organize new investment for places even before we think about the infrastructure. And just one example of why we need to do this is we don't, for autonomous vehicles, transportation is one way or the other going to become a lot more seamless and fluid, which is going to further perpetuate people being able to travel where they like and go where they like. And right now, autonomous vehicles are selling themselves as sort of a frictionless, free mobility experience that may actually perpetuate a negative growth of these areas. It may allow people to sort of sleep in their car and commute 9 hours overnight to work or something like that. And whether this stuff is true or not isn't the point. It's actually it's an excuse to reinvent what kind of communities we want to have, and then how do we support and design this technology to support these places. So what we're trying to convince, and we know some of the new people that are going to Uber and some of these AV companies, and they have a really bad image right now, which is why they all the more want to be seen as urbanists and for places. So we're trying to help them see how if they sell a transportation system and a regional transportation system defined around destinations that people go to, not through, that they can actually outcompete non-AVs, because AVs won't have to park at their destination. They can keep going. They'll be more compatible with car sharing systems, so they can be used more often. But they also will want a regional transportation system that's defined around lots of destinations that you have pickups and drop-offs. That's sort of networked, that ultimately is also more compatible with biking, walking, and transit. So we need to facilitate this vision of the future to make it to happen. It won't happen just by being contextually sensitive with our projects or just meeting demand for infrastructure. We're going to keep causing all the problems we're facing if we lead that way.
Kathryn, how would Shire of Greenfield or the City of Casey develop that vision, knowing that across the fence from the Paddock is an established community? You've been through this before. So how do you establish that community vision, and what sort of areas of council are involved in that?
Gosh, that's a good question. It takes a lot of dedicated time and focus and thinking about a community that aren't there yet. It is really hard you're their voice until they're there. So it's trying to predict those challenges and opportunities that will exist in advance and get on top of them early. And through visioning, there's two tactics in that. There's try and create a sense of place in the new Paddock and in that new estate, and we do that through early delivery of community infrastructure as a catalyst to a whole range of other things to sow a seed for placemaking, because they're early services that the community will need. The alternative to that is that the established areas or the places next door will benefit from the growth as it comes. That's where they will have to rely on for things for quite some time. So you will get this bleeding of communities, which is actually good. I don't think that's not a bad thing. In terms of a vision, it is really hard to get the community to understand what the future will be like there. In Casey, I think it's something like 60% of the residents in Casey weren't there 15, 20 years ago. This is all still new to them. They're like, yeah, whatever. I'm not fussed. When's the road getting built? When's the school getting built? When's the freeway getting upgraded? So they're really not in a place to really assist in that, and it's trying to then rely on data and demographics to preempt what will be needed and plan for that.
One of the great things that I think about when we're talking about greenfield sites, and especially a lot of the demographics we know, families, young children, there's not a lot of time in life to engage with council about what you want in your community, because you're in the car going to work You're coming home trying to spend some time with the family or trying to do some sport or volunteer in the community. There's not a lot of time for that. So I suppose that leads to that next question about home time, work time, quality of life. Michael touched on it with the amount of time people will be spending in their cars, the number of cars. Where will people be working, and how can local government try and influence that? Or Michael, what are the other levers that government has that could be employed here?
Well, I think one of the other key concerns I had with the scenario you've described is CBD 60 kilometres away. That's fine, but the major job hubs are 10 or 15 kilometres away, so work is not nearby. And I think if the new emerging community can have enough social infrastructure in terms of schools, hospitals, retail precincts, etc., that generate jobs locally so that people are spending less time in their cars, that helps a lot towards building the community. And I think there's simply a time displacement, that if people are working full-time and then spending 2, 3, 4 hours in the car either side of that, there is no room for the rest of it. There's no volunteering or participation in sports or already family life. It's all outsourced.
Kim, you've been doing some interesting work thinking about where all the new residents of Western Sydney are going to be working. What have you found there?
Look, I think this question about work is critical. So in Sydney there's a vision to have 30-minute cities where people live and work 30 minutes from where they live, and there's lots of projections and forecasts of, there'll be 100,000 people and there'll be 30,000 jobs. But what hasn't happened is thinking about what those jobs are. And I think that there's lots of talk about the future of work in terms of, we know that jobs are changing. We know that technology is creating jobs that we haven't even invented yet. I think of my primary school aged children who wants to be a gamer, and I think, that's probably a viable career choice for him. But we haven't thought about what that future of work means outside of the workplace and for land use planning, and how do we get people to be working in different ways. And so I've just done this a piece of work in Western Sydney around the new airport and what that means for jobs. And what I've discovered is, one, the ANZCO codes, the Australian New Zealand classification of occupations. So anyone who's had employment forecasts done about industries, they will have been based on the ANZCO codes, because that's how all the ABS data is coded. You tend to apply a propensity of different industries to your population forecast. The ANZCO codes are 10 years out of date. Now that means there's lots of jobs that people do now that are not counted in our data. So data scientist, there's no code for it. Cybersecurity specialist, there's no code for it. So if we can't even understand really the jobs people are doing now, how are we thinking about that for the future? And the way that we can work. And there's been lots of talk about people working remotely and from home, but we also know that people crave contact with other people. And so I work in a shared office space with lots of different companies, and people come in as single person reps for their companies, or they're sole operators, and they come in so that we can chat over the coffee machine and talk about what's in the newspaper. So I think these are the critical issues. And so when we're creating a community that's going to have 120,000 people, the jobs are absolutely essential. We have to work, we need money. And I think, Ethan, you made a point earlier about the entrepreneurship and how do we bring private enterprise into this discussion about placemaking. I think we need to do that more in Australia. We've, at Astrolabe Group, have done a lot of work on city deals, and there's great interaction across governments, the universities, but private enterprise has not necessarily been part of that conversation. Well, they're the anchor tenants in new developments, they employ people, and so I think there's an opportunity to do that in a different way as well.
Anyone on the panel? We have a federal member of parliament in the room. What are some legislative changes? What is the federal mindset? What's the federal policy settings that need to change to make sure that if new communities are built in greenfield sites, they're supported to succeed rather than, you know, really put at risk from the get-go. Any ideas?
From my perspective, I think there's a couple of things. First that Greenfield Shire is not going to solve the housing affordability problem of the capital city on its own. It simply cannot.
Yep.
And nor should it be expected to. I think the other is, what I'd like to see more of in this country is more integrated planning, so that the planning for location of schools and the timing of rollout of schools, the planning of transport, particularly rail and light rail development is done with a little bit of anticipation and coordination with release of land for housing, rather than one going ahead of the other. If rail goes well ahead of housing, there are some challenges there for feasibility. If it's the other way around, it's even harder. You know, do it in a coordinated way and things can actually start to work. Same across healthcare and a range of other portfolios. But it's about working across government as well as working between layers of government.
Yeah, I agree that it's this ability to work together. That's where city deals have been really successful, is that there's been agreement across 3 levels of government on what the priorities are and commitments made in terms of human resources and funding. And it sounds really boring. It's been to set up the governance processes that actually enable all of those 3 layers of government to work together, and the silos within each of those layers of government, because that is a huge challenge. And if that doesn't happen, then those pieces around schools, you know, state responsibility, your primary healthcare system, federal money supports that, the hospital, state, local government that's, you know, got the childcare centre. So I think bringing all of that together is really critical.
So yeah, this is an exciting question that we want to figure out more about as well. In the Obama administration, there was, there were efforts both at the federal level to get agencies to collaborate more. They'd been in their silos, and one of the ways they did that was make sure their grants, the communities at the ground actually had to collaborate to get the grants. So and some of the grants started to be more about not just delivering projects, but building some capacity. But the process of even them applying for the grant caused them to collaborate in ways that they didn't across, the arts and culture people and the transportation and the facilities people. But yeah, a big issue too in the U.S. has been that most of the funding is for isolated projects, just for roads, just for community centers, and there's no thought on where it's placed, on how you leverage these investments. And so federal funding can perpetuate the sort of project-led, infrastructure-led transformation. So figuring out how to do it as more of a place-led, capacity-building-led approach is important.
So if we are talking about silos again and the role of government, are we in our own silo, within a silo, within a silo? And how are we connected to the private sector in this? So, as Kim said, and we've talked about relationships with developers, and we've got some wonderful representatives in the room from UDIA and Property Council and developers. And what do we need from them? What do they need from us? What would make this Paddock to Postcode scenario the best possible outcome? Are there silos there we need to break down? Kathryn, do you have?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So it's starting from a basis that you have to try to accept that you both want a good outcome for the community in the end, and working together, being clear on a commitment to each other, and a commitment from what we do from local government to the development sector. We will listen, we'll think through any ideas that you've got. We're not going to just shut things down. We're going to be open to change, open to innovation, open to collaboration, and from their perspective, commitments to us around, we will share with you the privatised, information about purchases. So we get that earlier insight into the types of people that are looking and putting down interest in our new estates. So we're trying to build a relationship of trust as much as we can use that word to try and work through that in the infancy, the real early stages, and do a lot more work at the pre-stages with the sector so that by the end it becomes much more smoother sailing and everyone's quite clear on what they're trying to achieve, and working through that becomes much more smooth and seamless. So I think absolutely there's plenty more we can do with our with the rest of our broader sector in terms of developing from Paddock to Postcode, and I think it's valuable for them because then if we can then do something a bit different, it helps them from a marketing perspective. If it helps us then commit to delivering something earlier than we would have otherwise in their estate, that's another marketing point of difference. So it does seem to be working better for us, working more in partnership and collaboration with the private sector than it had before, where it was a bit more adversarial and more the infrastructure's not there, you can't develop because it's just not acceptable. I think we're at a point now that's still going to happen. So how do we just run with it and make the best of the scenario that we've got and the policy framework and the policy environment that we've got from the state and to have to work within?
I'd like, if there's anyone in the room who'd like to add something to that, not looking at anyone in particular, you're welcome to. And I'd like to open the floor if there are comments and questions from here on in. But I might just get Ethan to comment a bit on that too, about private sector as well as community, and Michael might have some ideas too.
Our general theory is that the more multi-sector the place governance on every scale, the better, but in every context, in every part of the world, the placemaking conversation is being led by one sector, and we want to celebrate that, encourage that, but then we want to figure out how do we get the other partners and sectors involved, the other demographics, how do we diversify it in every way. From a private sector perspective, they often have been, again, a limiting factor. They've been destructive of place, of the way they've developed paddocks effectively has been some of the most destructive patterns of land use and investment in the world. But I also think that they're the ones that, especially in Australia, that can most turn this around. And if we could demonstrate how place-led models of development can drive a little bit more private value and a lot more public value, then that system will go viral, not just in Australia but globally. So there's a big impetus to do this, and I find it actually the easiest sector to convince of placemaking. They do it the way it's been done before. There's a lot of momentum to the way development happens. So they need a little help. They need some incentives and some assistance to keep pushing the paradigm. But I do think that you have a lot of the leading models happening in Australia, and you have the will and interests, and also private sector developers they want to be cool. They want to be looked at favorably. There's a good accountability, I think, here in Australia to it, and they get rewarded if they do something well. So they probably just need to be pushed and supported to go much further. But this is key, because this is I work a lot with you and Habitat on the New Urban Agenda, and we got public spaces to be included in that, and the Sustainable Development Goals on Goal 11.7, and so they're trying to figure out how to implement it. But the challenge is there's no private sector people involved in the implementation of the New Urban Agenda, yet it's them that are the only people that can really help scale this impact. So no pressure on you all, but we have to figure out the models in these in the fast urbanizing areas of Australia is the most likely place in the world to figure out these models of development that can be replicated and scaled elsewhere in the world. So.
Sounds good. Any other comments from the panel there on that? Or any other comments from the floor? I'll pose a question then. What could go wrong in this paddock? What could go wrong? And just in a couple of words, how would you avoid that scenario? Kim, you've got some ideas on what could go wrong.
So the first thing is, of course, the projections might be wrong, and we've seen that many times. And so a lot of the work that we do is about how do you work out how to monitor the assumptions. So as I said, population projections, employment forecasts, they all have assumptions into them, and there is no one forecast or projection that is going to be right. The only thing I do know is it will be wrong. It's the scale of that wrongness. And so how you avoid that is you monitor the assumption. So if there's an assumption of, 100,000 people moving in, is that actually happening? The data allow you to do that. If there's an assumption of people travelling in or out for work, how do you monitor that? And then how do you work out what the data doesn't allow you to measure? And I think Jessica made a really good case for how you can start looking at some of those other things. I would also say never trust one forecast. It's difficult, but the more the better, because if you get really different forecasts, there's a reason for it. Is it the assumptions? Is it the base data? Is it the model itself? We know from election forecasting outcomes and the horse race on Melbourne Cup Day, we know that the more forecasts you have, the more likely you're going to land somewhere near it. So it's just about, finding ways. It's not a set and forget. You've got to keep engaged with it.
Sorry, put Kathryn in a bad headspace here.
So I don't know if this is what everyone wants to hear, but I'm really afraid that there actually will be over-investment in some infrastructure, that will invest in projects, not places, that will invest in roads, not streets, facilities, not destinations, sort of single-use facilities. Too much parking is a bit. These are things that ultimately have major costs for maintenance down the road that will be incurred by these councils. And once you build roads that are built for certain speeds, it's really hard to in throughput to make these streets that are places for communities again. So under designing for the ultimate desired speeds for these communities. And designing to be flexible, and designing things to evolve and change as much as possible. We're designing for demand rather than for what we need. We need houses to be smaller in the future. The future of work is to be outside and mixing more in smaller offices. Much more in cafes on streets. That's the way we're going to reduce our commute times and reduce our time in the car. And increase the innovation time, increase the sort of more participatory work culture, the more fun lifestyles that people that can move where they like will be attracted to in the future. So we'll need less space, less infrastructure, and those are the places that will thrive. It will attract the investment, the young people, the culturally creative places.
Michael, what do you think could go wrong in this scenario, and and what would you do about it?
Well, all sorts of things could go wrong. I mean, another minister from another government might announce a very fast rail that goes straight past the Shire, making this satellite town just past it a lot more affordable. The Shire might suddenly become very unaffordable and really fail to solve the city's affordability issues. And again, it's coordination. Yeah. So when different parts of government or different layers of government or different sectors are not working together. I guess picking up on the city deals issue, I think city deals can work very well. I think we don't have very much data on whether they have worked very well in this country. I think one of the challenges is we don't know what's happened because of the city deals and what would have happened anyway. And in fact, for most of them, we don't even know what the purpose is. There's a deal going on and that involves 3 layers of government. Good. But we could do better than that. Yeah. We could actually have a stated set of goals and targets and maybe even measure them and see how we've done.
Wow, Michael. You're being silly now.
And then we might even improve the model,
Okay.
Go crazy.
Yep. All right, Kathryn, I'm going to sort of finish with you, really, because you're at the coalface. Probably local government has the highest risk to take here and possibly the most to lose, because as much as you're constructing and building a community, it's going to be part of the Shire of Greenfield forever. How do you get ready for that? What could go wrong in your planning? And how do you make sure you keep it working properly?
Good question. It's a real privilege to be in a position to work in local government where the people that you serve, the community, They have no, once they're there and they live there and they buy there, that's it. They have to interact with you. So it's not like they can get their bins collected by another council. So, you know, it is really about providing a really solid customer experience and giving the ratepayers, you know, the best value for their money. And that's where a lot of, you know, how we work through that from a risk perspective, from a service level perspective, moving forward, it's going to be really challenging. Like, we're addicted to growth, we're addicted to the revenue, the infrastructure, the you know, these people move in, they're pretty self-sufficient, they don't need a whole lot, they might need a kindergarten, they might need some roads and drains and bins and stuff, but you know, it's real dynamic that where the infrastructure's new, it doesn't need maintaining for a while, so we're in a real easy spot, or the Shire of Greenfield will be for some time. So it's about just not getting used to that and just being really proactive and planning ahead in making sure that it is sustainable and it is long term, and the future generations that are there can continue to really thrive and doing the best, cultivating the best environment possible for that to happen. So you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about things like that at Casey, just to make sure that we do leave the place better than when we got here.
Yeah, great. That's a wonderful note to end on. And just to let you know, we have been recording this session, and we are going to keep working on it, because I think, as we've heard today, not just Alliance members but other councils, there's a whole journey through growth, and some of us are just emerging growth areas. Some are really well established but still have greenfield development. So we're going to keep working on this, because I think it's such an opportunity that we have right in front of us to transform that paddock into a postcode and to do it well. So we'd love to make sure that we can continue to identify those blockages and the ways around them, to make the best possible place we can with the best quality of life possible. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panellists this afternoon.